a hunger that tested hearts. The sun was beginning to sink behind the rolling hills of Galilee, leaving streaks of gold across the sky as thousands of people gathered on the grassy slope. They had been following Jesus since early morning. Men, women, children, the elderly, the broken, the curious, and the desperate. No one wanted to leave. There was something about his presence that calmed storms inside their hearts. Something about his words that felt like water to thirsty souls. But as the day stretched into late afternoon, one problem grew larger than the crowd itself: hunger. Real, painful hunger. The kind that turns whispers into complaints and weakness into worry. The disciples felt it first. They looked around at the vast sea of people, 5,000 men, not counting the women and children, and panic crept into their voices. "Master, we should send them away," one of them said quietly. "Let them go to the nearby villages and buy food. We can't feed this many." Jesus looked at the crowd with compassion, his eyes soft but steady. "They don't need to go," he said. "You give them something to eat." The disciples exchanged helpless looks. "US, feed them?" Even if they worked for months, they couldn't afford enough bread for everyone. They didn't have the money, they didn't have the resources, and they definitely didn't have a plan. But Jesus wasn't asking for resources, he was asking for faith. Meanwhile, in the middle of the enormous crowd stood a small boy. His clothes were simple, his hands dusty from the long journey, but he clutched something precious, a small woven basket his mother had packed that morning. Inside were 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. Hardly a meal for one hungry boy, let alone thousands. Yet as the murmurs spread and uncertainty grew, something inside the boy stirred. Maybe it was courage, maybe innocence, maybe the simple belief that if Jesus could heal the sick, then he could do something with what little he had. He stepped forward. Andrew noticed him and gently asked, "Son, would you give this to the teacher?" The boy nodded. When Andrew brought the basket to Jesus, he almost apologized. "Lord, this is all we found. But what is this among so many?" Jesus didn't laugh. He didn't question. He simply smiled, as if he had been waiting for this moment all day. "Bring it here to me." The impossible request. As the boy's small basket rested in Jesus' hands, the disciples stood frozen, unsure whether to feel relieved or embarrassed. 5 loaves, 2 fish. Before them stretched a crowd so huge it looked like a living ocean swaying in the evening breeze. There was no way, absolutely no way, this tiny offering could satisfy so many. Jesus didn't rush. He didn't panic. Instead, he looked at his disciples and gave them an unexpected instruction, one that made even less sense than asking them to feed the crowd. "Have the people sit down." The disciples blinked. "Sit down now." But Jesus' tone left no room for debate. They moved through the massive crowd, telling everyone to sit on the thick green grass. Families gathered close. Strangers shared space. Children laughed as they found spots beside their parents. Soon, the entire hillside looked like a giant amphitheater, waiting for something extraordinary. But the disciples still didn't understand. Peter whispered, "What is he planning?" John shook his head. "I don't know, but I've seen enough to trust that he always has a reason." High above on the hill, Jesus lifted the small basket and gazed toward the heavens. The boy watched in awe as the teacher gave thanks not for a feast, not for abundance, but for the little that was offered, and that alone was enough for a miracle to begin. The disciples stepped closer. Jesus broke a piece of bread and placed it into their hands. "Start giving it to them," he said simply. They hesitated, staring at the small pieces. If they distributed this, it would run out immediately. They would be humiliated. The people would be angry. This seemed impossible. But there was something in Jesus' voice, a calm authority that pushed fear aside. So they walked. Peter approached a group of 20 people and gave out bread. He expected the basket to feel lighter. It didn't. Thomas handed fish to a group of older men. He expected it to run out. It didn't. James reached a family with little children, and when he looked back into his hands, there was still more. Piece after piece, hand after hand, row after row. The disciples felt confusion turn to shock, and shock turned to wonder. Something impossible was happening, something no human could explain. And it all began with one command, one step of obedience, and one small offering placed in the hands of Jesus. Miracle unfolding before their eyes. The hillside had grown quiet, an unusual silence for a gathering of thousands. It wasn't fear or confusion or impatience. It was wonder, pure, breath-held wonder. Everywhere the disciples walked, something impossible kept happening right in their hands. Andrew, still holding the boy's original basket, stared inside it again and again. Every time he reached in, another loaf appeared as if the basket itself were breathing life. This can't be real," he whispered. Philip, the one who once calculated the exact cost of feeding the crowd, now felt his calculations crumble. He handed out bread to a group of mothers and children, then looked back at the loaf that hadn't shrunk at all. A stunned laugh slipped out of him. "Lord, what are you doing?" Across the hillside, families began to eat slowly at first, then eagerly. Children took large bites, surprised at how warm and fresh the bread tasted. Elderly men closed their eyes, savoring fish that seemed fuller and richer than anything they had eaten in years. A tired mother whispered to her daughter, "Eat, child. It's enough for all of us," though she still didn't understand how. No one understood. But no one could deny it. The miracle was happening in plain sight. And yet, in the middle of it all stood Jesus, calm, steady, almost hidden behind the movement of his disciples. He wasn't raising his hands dramatically. He wasn't calling down lightning from the sky. The miracle flowed through him quietly, effortlessly, like mercy itself taking shape. The young boy who had offered his lunch stood beside Andrew, eyes wide and shining. He watched bread multiply from what once belonged to him. Is this because of my basket?" he asked softly. Andrew smiled, kneeling beside him. "This happened because you didn't hold back." The boy looked out at the massive crowd eating joyfully. His heart swelled with something new, something powerful. He realized that in the hands of Jesus, even the smallest gift had a destiny far bigger than he imagined. As the disciples made their way back up the hill, every one of them felt the same truth settle deep inside. This wasn't just about food. This wasn't just about hunger. This was a lesson one Jesus was teaching them through every step, every filled hand, every satisfied stomach. A lesson about faith, about trust, about what happens when human limitation meets divine provision. When every basket overflowed. By now, the sun had dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. But no one was thinking about the sunset. All eyes were fixed on the miracle unfolding across the hillside. Everywhere the disciples turned, people were eating joyfully, freely, without fear that the food would run out. Because it didn't run out, not once. Peter, who began with barely enough for a single family, now found himself handing food to group after group. With a grin spreading across his face. "Take more," he laughed, unable to contain his disbelief. "There's plenty." John walked carefully through the crowd, watching the expressions change from hunger to relief, then to joy. A father tore a piece of bread and gave it to his son. "Eat, David," he said, his voice shaking. This is a blessing." Everywhere, the sound of eating mixed with quiet gasps and stunned whispers. But the turning point came when the disciples began to notice something even. Stranger people weren't just getting a little food. They were eating until they were full, completely satisfied. Matthew, holding a basket that never emptied, stopped in the middle of the crowd. "How is this possible?" he murmured. "How can thousands eat from what wasn't even enough for one boy?" Behind him, Jesus watched with a gentle smile. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't anxious. He wasn't overwhelmed. This moment was exactly what he intended, not only to feed stomachs, but to stretch hearts. When nearly everyone had eaten their fill, Jesus called out to his disciples, "Gather the leftovers so that nothing is wasted." Leftovers? The disciples exchanged puzzled looks. How could there be leftovers when the original meal wasn't even enough for one family? But they obeyed as they moved through the crowd, collecting what remained. Shock struck them all over again. Every group, every cluster, every family had more bread and fish left than they started with. The disciples filled one basket, then a second, then a third. By the time they climbed back up the hillside, they had gathered 12 full baskets, one overflowing basket for each disciple. Peter stared at the mountain of leftovers, shaking his head. "We began with almost nothing, and now we have more than the crowd could finish." Jesus looked at them, his voice calm, almost whisper soft. "This," he said, "is what faith looks like. In my hands." The disciples fell silent, realizing this miracle wasn't just about food. It was about trust that multiplies when placed in the hands of the one who provides. The crowd that saw more than a meal. As the disciples stood around the 12 overflowing baskets, the crowd began to rise from the grassy hillside. Children wiped crumbs from their lips. Mothers held their babies close, whispering prayers of gratitude. Fathers looked out at the teacher with a reverence that went beyond admiration. Something had shifted in the air, something deep, something powerful. People weren't just full, they were awakened. All across the hillside, voices began to rise. Did you see what he did? He fed all of us with one small basket. This has to be the prophet we've been waiting for. No one else can do what he just did. The miracle had rippled through thousands of hearts at once. Tired travelers who had come for healing discovered strength. Curious listeners who had come for teachings discovered faith. Skeptics who had come to judge found themselves speechless, and the poor, those who had known, hunger far too often, ate more that evening than they had in weeks. Yet through all the excitement, Jesus remained calm. He didn't bask in their praise. He didn't claim attention. He simply stood, watching the people he loved rejoice in the goodness of God. But deep inside, he knew what the crowd didn't. They were seeing the miracle, but not yet understanding the message. Some men rushed through the crowd, spreading word quickly. We should make him our king. Yes, a king who can feed armies. If he can multiply food, imagine what else he can do for our nation. A dangerous excitement began to swell, one that threatened to twist the miracle into something political, something Jesus never came to be. Peter noticed the shift first. "Lord," he said quietly, "they're getting ideas." James added, "They want to force you into kingship." But Jesus' eyes were steady, filled with a calm the disciples couldn't match. "They're seeing the bread," he said softly, "but not the one who gives it." He knew that if the crowd crowned him king for the wrong reason, they would never understand his true purpose, not to rule earthly kingdoms, but to transform human hearts. The disciples watched as the people pressed closer, voices rising, excitement building, the miracle turning into a movement that could erupt into chaos. And at that very moment, Jesus made a decision that would surprise them all, a decision that would lead them into the next part of the story, where faith would once again be tested, not with hunger, but with obedience and trust. The retreat into the mountains. As the crowd's excitement swelled, Jesus could feel the shift happening faster than the disciples could comprehend. What began as gratitude was turning into a force, an emotional wave of people ready to seize him, crown him, and declare him their earthly king. They were hungry for a ruler who could fill their stomachs, calm their fears, and lead their nation with miraculous power. But Jesus had not come for a throne made of human expectations. Before the momentum could grow any stronger, Jesus turned to his disciples with surprising urgency. "Go to the boat," he instructed. "Cross over to the other side of the sea. I will dismiss the crowd myself." The disciples hesitated. The hillside was buzzing with commotion, and they didn't want to leave him alone. Peter spoke first. "Lord, are you sure? They're getting restless. They want something from you." Jesus placed a steady hand on Peter's shoulder. "Go. This is not the time for you to be caught in their plans." Though confused, they obeyed. The disciples gathered their things, heading toward the shoreline as Jesus moved toward the crowd alone. With quiet authority, he began dismissing them, not with shouting, not with force, just a calm presence that made them listen. "Go in peace. Go home to your families. You have eaten your fill today. Give thanks to God." The people, still buzzing with wonder, slowly began to disperse. Some lingered, hoping he might speak again. Others held their children close, pointing to him with admiration. But gradually, the hillside cleared. When the last voices faded into the distance, the world grew still. The evening breeze brushed across the grass as Jesus walked toward the mountains behind the lake. He climbed quietly, step by step, until he reached a place high above the world, far from noise, far from expectations, far from the crowd that wanted a king. Here, he prayed, He prayed for the people who only saw miracles, but not the message. He prayed for his disciples, whose faith was growing but still fragile. He prayed for strength for the path ahead, a path that led not to an earthly crown but to a cross. Below him, the disciples were already pushing their boat into the water, unaware of the storm that would soon rise against them. Jesus, alone on the mountain, lifted his eyes toward heaven, knowing what was coming next. A night of fear, a test of faith, and a moment where his power would once again move across the waters. The storm that shook their courage. Night settled over the Sea of Galilee like a heavy curtain. The disciples, rowing as Jesus commanded, expected a calm journey across the water. But the farther they moved from shore, the more restless the wind became. At first, it was only a breeze. Then the waves grew choppy. Then the sky darkened deeper than usual, as if the night itself were tightening around them. Peter steadied the boat. "Keep rowing," he said. "The master told us to cross. We'll make it." But the sea had other plans. Without warning, a violent gust slammed into the boat. Waves rose like walls and crashed against their sides, soaking them, shaking them, pushing them back. The disciples fought hard, their arms burning, their breaths short. John yelled over the roar, "Where is this coming from?" The sky was clear. Andrew gripped the oar so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Just keep rowing. Don't stop." But the storm grew fiercer. The wind howled as if the sea itself had woken angry. Water sloshed inside the boat. The mast groaned. Every wave threatened to flip them over. Hours passed, or at least it felt like hours. The disciples' muscles trembled with exhaustion. Their confidence eroded with every strike of the storm. Faith that had glowed brightly on the hillside dimmed in the darkness. Thomas, shaking, looked toward the sky. Why would he send us out here, alone into this? Peter snapped back, but even his voice carried doubt. He told us to cross. He must have known what was coming. And then came the thought none of them wanted to admit. If Jesus were here, this storm wouldn't terrify us. But he wasn't with them. He was still on the mountain, praying. Lightning split the sky for an instant, revealing the massive waves throwing their boat around like a leaf in the wind. Fear clawed at their hearts. For the first time since they started following him, some wondered if they might not survive the night. James shouted, "Row harder." Philip cried, "We're not going to make it." Their voices were swallowed by thunder. Yet in the middle of the chaos, in the very moment their strength failed, their hope cracked, and their courage collapsed, something began to move across the storm. Something the sea could not swallow. Something the wind could not shake. A figure stepping on the waves, as if the ocean were solid ground. The figure walking on the waves. The storm raged with unrelenting fury, tossing the disciples' boat like a toy in the hands of an angry sea. The wind screamed. The waves pounded. Fear had grown so thick in their hearts that it felt like the night itself was closing in on them. Then, almost too small to notice at first, Peter saw something through the sheets of rain. A shape, a silhouette, a figure moving across the surface of the water. He blinked hard, wiping the sea spray from his eyes. "Something's out there," he shouted. John turned and saw it too. No, that can't be." Andrew gasped. "It's walking." Panic shot through the boat like lightning. "It's a ghost," one of them cried. "This storm is cursed. We're done, we're finished." Their voices trembled with terror. A figure walking on top of a raging sea was not just unnatural, it was impossible. Everything in their minds screamed that this was a sign of death, a nightmare rising out of the storm. But the figure kept moving steady, calm, unaffected by the chaos. Step by step, closer and closer. Then a voice cut through the storm. Clear, strong, familiar. "Take courage. It is I, do not be afraid." The disciples froze. The wind howled. The waves roared. But for a moment, none of it mattered. Peter's breath caught in his chest. "Lord, is that you?" Lightning flashed, illuminating the figure, and there he was, Jesus, standing on the waves as if they were as solid as stone. No fear in his face, no panic in his step, just absolute authority over everything that terrified them. The disciples stared in disbelief. The one who multiplied bread now walked on the very water that threatened their lives. Jesus called again, his voice steady. "Do not be afraid." Fear began melting out of their hearts, replaced by awe. Awe at his power, awe at his presence, awe at the fact that even in their storm, especially in their storm, he came to them. Peter stepped closer to the edge of the boat, heartbeat racing. "Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you on the water." The disciples turned toward him, shocked. This was Peter's boldness, reckless to some, faith-filled to others. Jesus didn't hesitate. "Come." The word carried power, the kind that turns fear into faith, the kind that invites the impossible. Peter placed his hands on the edge of the boat, lifted one foot, and stepped onto the raging sea, the step that challenged gravity. The moment Peter's foot touched the water, time seemed to slow. The waves still rolled, the wind still whipped, but under Peter's sandal, the surface held firm. Not like stone, not like sand, something different, something sustained by power, not nature. The disciples stared wide-eyed as Peter lifted his other foot and stepped fully onto the sea. He didn't sink, he didn't stumble, he stood. For a heartbeat, all he could do was look at Jesus standing a short distance away, calm as the storm raged around them. Peter took a step, then another, each one bolder than the last. The thunder meant nothing. The waves meant nothing. Fear meant nothing. All that mattered was the one calling him forward. "You're doing it," John shouted from the boat. "Peter, you're really walking," James cried. Peter almost laughed out loud. The impossible, something no human had ever done, was happening beneath his feet. Every step was a miracle woven with faith. Every movement was proof that as long as his eyes stayed on Jesus, nothing in creation, not even the laws of nature, could hold him back. But then, something shifted. A wave crashed higher than the rest, spraying cold water across Peter's face. The wind screamed louder, twisting around him like a warning. The storm didn't calm just because he stepped out. It grew wilder, fiercer, threatening to pull his attention away. And for a split second, he looked at the storm instead of the Savior. Fear rushed in like icy water. "What am I doing?" Peter whispered. This isn't possible." The moment fear replaced faith, gravity returned with merciless force. Peter's foot sank, his balance slipped. The water swallowed his legs, then his waist. Panic erupted in his chest. "Lord, save me!" His cry cut through the night. Immediately, not after a moment, not after a hesitation immediately, Jesus reached out and grabbed his hand. His grip was firm, unshakable, filled with both strength and love. Jesus lifted Peter back up as easily as lifting a child. The storm still raged, but his voice remained steady. "O you of little faith," he said softly, "why did you doubt?" Not a rebuke of anger, a question of the heart, a reminder that Peter wasn't sinking because the storm was big, but because he momentarily forgot who was bigger. Hand in hand, Jesus and Peter turned toward the boat, while the disciples watched in breathless awe, knowing the greatest moment of the night was still yet to come. The calm that revealed his identity. Jesus and Peter walked together across the storm-tossed water, Peter still trembling from the fear that had dragged him down only moments earlier. But now, with Jesus' hand locked firmly around his, the waves didn't seem so threatening. The wind didn't seem as loud. The storm no longer felt like an enemy, it felt like a stage for something greater. The disciples watched in stunned silence as the two figures approached the boat. No one spoke, no one moved. Their eyes were wide with awe, their hearts beating in their throats. Moments earlier, they thought they were about to die. Now they were witnessing a sight so holy, so impossible, that words couldn't describe it. As Jesus stepped into the boat, something happened that none of them expected. The wind stopped instantly. No gradual fading, no slow calming of the waves. Just one breath, and the storm obeyed him. The sea flattened into a glassy stillness. The clouds drifted apart. The moonlight broke across the water like silver. It was as if creation itself bowed before him. The disciples gasped. Some dropped to their knees. Others covered their faces with trembling hands. The silence that followed wasn't fear, it was worship. Peter collapsed inside the boat, soaked and breathless. But even he couldn't look away from Jesus. For the first time, the disciples weren't just amazed. They understood. Not just a teacher, not just a healer, not just a miracle worker. Someone with authority over nature, over storms, over fear itself. Someone only God could be. One by one, the disciples began to speak. Their voices hushed, trembling. "Truly, you are the Son of God." Their words rose from the boat like a soft chorus carried by the now gentle breeze. They had seen him multiply bread. They had seen him feed thousands with a child's lunch. But this moment on the water revealed something deeper, not just his provision, his identity. Jesus looked around at them, his expression gentle. He didn't correct them. He didn't silence them. He received their worship because it was true. As the boat glided across the calm sea toward the distant shore, a new understanding settled in their hearts. The miracle on the hillside had filled their stomachs, but the miracle on the water filled their faith. From that night forward, they would never see him the same way again. The one who fed the 5,000 was also the one who commanded the storm, and the one who would lead them into a purpose far greater than they could imagine.